I'm really excited to be here with you all today and to really talk about and think about how do we unlock the potential of the young people we work with? How do we take that journey with them to become who we know that they're destined to be? I want to transport you for a second to the year 2045. I want you to imagine you're walking through the grocery store and out the corner of your eye, you hear someone say, "Mr. Smith." And you look over and it's that student that you used to work with. Every time she came into the room, you said, "Lord, please help me with this day." And the student runs up to you and says, I'm so glad that I'm getting a chance to see you. I've been going through a lot when I was younger, and I went through a lot, and now I have a steady job. I have a family that I'm taking care of, and they continue to rattle off all these achievements that you thought would never happen to this particular kid. And as they talk, you start to reminisce and think about their story and how their story sounds so similar to another young person's story who had to fight for everything to achieve what he achieved. He came from a community where he didn't get anything to help him get to where he needed to go. And throughout his journey and his fight, he finally got to the championship of what he was trying to do. And despite losing that fight, you knew that he unlocked his potential, and you're sitting there, everything fades away in front of this student, and you know that person became a champion when you hear, "Adrian!" And this idea of our young people being able to see the potential of who they can potentially become becomes all that you understand. And part of the reason why you said Adrian is because that's actually the student's name. And so you're shouting Adrian, and you're thinking this kid overcame every single thing that they were up against to become a champion and to unlock their potential. And they said it was because of a teacher that saw in them something that they didn't see in themselves. And so today, I want us to talk about, I hope you're feeling hype, you're ready to fight, become champions this a couple of days. And part of what I want us to really think about is this promise of potential. By anyone's estimation, Adrian had become a success. Adrian had dealt with all the challenges that came with growing up in a tough neighborhood, had dealt with whatever challenges happened at home in order to be able to become who she became and eventually become a productive citizen. And this idea of success is so important. And we generally measure success in ways that we can understand, with grades and with our ability to make sure that students are becoming who they need to become behaviorally, socially, and emotionally. But what I want us to think about is whether our definition of success accounts for the journey along the way. Now, Adrian was clearly a success story because she overcame all these things, but there was a young man that I worked with named Ty who didn't have what we would call success in the terms that Adrian had it. Ty, he was a young man who was in and out of foster care since he was young and eventually ended up in juvenile detention, having to go to school, having to deal with all these different issues. And for Ty, one of his biggest challenges was being able to reintegrate into school and back into his community. And most people would say, by any measure, Ty was not successful. But the question becomes, how are we defining success in order to reach the full potential of who our young people can become? And one of the moments that became very clear to me that we had work to do with Ty was when we actually were called in for a behavior management issue. Ty, he was in a classroom and the teacher told him that he couldn't do something. And so Ty took it upon himself to critically think about this situation, get on the desk and poop. And this was the moment that they decided to call us. They couldn't call us before that. It would have been nice to have the call before that. But they said clearly Ty is out of control because he's having difficulty regulating everything, including his bowels, apparently. And with this situation, it became so clear how important it is for us to be able to lock into behavior management, right? For us to be able to help young people regulate themselves in some way. And this is actually a foundational principle for what we understand to be the skills, the social emotional skills kids need to succeed. One of the most famous studies that have ever been conducted is the marshmallow experiment. How many people have seen the marshmallow experiment before, right? Most people have seen it. For those who haven't seen the marshmallow experiment, you gotta look it up on YouTube. So here's what they do. It's literally torture for kids. Say they have a marshmallow and they put it in front of 5, 6, 7-year-old. And they say, look, here is a marshmallow, one marshmallow. What I want you to do is I want you to wait until I come back in a few minutes. And if you can wait and not eat that marshmallow, then you will get 2 marshmallows. And so, the kids, they're doing everything in their power when the experimenter goes out to not eat that marshmallow. And so they're sniffing the marshmallow. They're looking around, trying not to look at the marshmallow. And then there's a couple of kids who are just gangster, like, oh, I don't care, I'm gonna eat that marshmallow. You put a marshmallow in front of me. And one of the things that they learned from this experiment was that kids who were able to wait for the second marshmallow show what we call frustration tolerance, right? And this frustration tolerance allowed them to be able to hold down jobs, graduate from school, have healthy relationships, all of these things that are important for life functioning. And this is something that was foundational to us being able to understand how we are able to build the skills kids need to succeed in life. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about helping young people figure out what skills they need to be able to regulate themselves, to be able to do the work that's needed in front of them, to be able to connect with people in healthy ways, a lot of this does require structure. It requires discipline. And it requires this social emotional learning at a higher level. But here's the thing. Kids don't learn as best they can from people they don't like. And when we talk about helping kids develop social emotional skills, sometimes we can get so focused on rules that they supersede relationship. And when rules supersede relationship and we're so locked into behavior management, we're missing what we can do to unlock potential. And this is pivotal in any of the circumstances that we deal with our kids, because the skills that we want them to have are, of course, important for their well-being and their success, but even more so, the skills that we show them, that we model through relationship, are ones that will stick with them and allow them to navigate challenges that we can't even imagine. And the reason why this is so important is because it forces us to think about, is our goal for kids to follow rules, or is our goal for them to succeed as their most productive self? And those are two different questions that we're asking ourselves when we think about the role rules play in us being able to give kids the skills they need to survive. But is it being filtered through relationship? One of the experiments related to the marshmallow study, they did an adaptation of it. And it was great. It was the same experiment of an experimenter coming in and bringing back the marshmallow, but they switched it. They added into this experiment in one part of the study for one set of kids. The experimenter said, I'm going to come back and bring some games, and then we're going to do the marshmallow experiment. That's what that experimenter did, and the results were fairly similar to what we generally see in the study. But in the other condition, what we saw was the experimenter say that I'm going to come back and I'm going to bring these games. And when I bring these games, we'll play and then we'll do the marshmallow experiment. Well, what this experimenter came back and did is just the marshmallow experiment. They did not bring back the games. What do you think those kids did? They said, I can't trust anything out this guy's mouth. I'm gonna go ahead and eat that marshmallow. And the level of frustration tolerance, their ability to deal with that uncomfortable situation, it declined significantly. And so much of being able to help kids understand rules is being able to build trust. Building trust over time allows those rules to become meaningful in ways that you never thought possible. And it allows you to be able to think about how you can build relationship through these rules. One of the best examples I've seen of this was a teacher who a student came into the classroom with this hat on. And the teacher said, you know you're not supposed to have your hat on in this class. And the student just wouldn't take it off. And so it was one of those fork in the road moments, right? Where you're saying, is this going to be the day? Is this going to be the day? And so the teacher takes a breath and she takes the young man aside and she says, look, you know the rules are for you to take your hat off. We need you to take your hat off. And why is it so difficult for you? So after a little bit of nudging, the student finally said, I just got placed in foster care, and this is the one thing connecting me with my mom. And it was in that moment that the teacher realized that the resistance, the conflict in the situation wasn't about the student not wanting to follow rules. It was about something that meant that much more to the student. It was about something that was deeper than what the teacher could see at the outset. And when we talk about that, part of what we're understanding is when we understand that rules can't supersede relationship, it allows us to be able to find other options. And so what this teacher says, look, I get why you want to hold on to this hat. Why don't we find a space that both of us think is a space that's safe, and we'll put the hat there and then you can get it at the end of the day. And the student, beyond what people might have expected, agreed with this solution. And what it did is it avoided a situation where they could escalate and the situation could go out of control and conflict arises. And they found a shared solution that still allowed them to reinforce the rules, but did it through relationship. And I want you to take a moment to think about an adult when you were a teenager who was always focused on rules and didn't seem to let you figure out how to handle situations in your own way. And what that brought up for you, right? Some of you guys are probably going to call your parents after this and say, I'm sorry for a couple of things or two, after thinking about kind of someone who tried to put into action all of these rules that didn't work. Now, one of the reasons why it can be really difficult for us to get beyond rules is because it's hard for us to see the entirety of who young people are. So what I want you guys to think about is take a moment. I want you to take a sheet of paper or your hand. I want you to just look at that big doll in this picture. So take a sheet of paper, roll it up, and just look through that one eye. And I want you to imagine the Adrians and the Ties and the young people who you just see this huge behavior outburst. And this ability, you can put your hands down because some of you look like pirates and it freaks me out. But imagine that you're trying to understand who a young person is, and you are only seeing that big behavior. This became very clear to me during my time at Rikers Island. I like to look at people and see what they think. I used to work at Rikers Island. Would there be a problem if it was otherwise? And so I worked at Rikers Island for a bit, and I never forget, there was this young man who, he said, I'm the biggest, I'm the baddest, no one's gonna mess with me. And so me and my coworker were in there doing cognitive behavioral groups, and we were doing all this good work, and we felt good about ourselves. But this one kid would not be able to actually connect with what we're saying because he said, it's not relevant for me. Someone can come for me and I don't care. And so we said, man, we cannot get through to this kid. And we were just seeing that big doll. We were just seeing that big behavior. And so we said, let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's uncover these layers that this young person has. And what we found out was that he had a child. And he had the mother of his baby, who was his girlfriend. And we said, all right, you're the biggest, you're the baddest, you're the one, Scarface, you're Scarface. Nobody's messing with you. But what if they say, he's locked up, I'm not gonna go for him, I'm gonna go for his girlfriend and kid. And for him, a light bulb went off. because what we did in that moment is we connected with something that was deeply meaningful for him and spoke to who he truly is. And so much of us moving beyond being locked into behavior management is being able to unlock the authentic identity of the young people we work with. So how do we begin to unlock this authentic identity? Part of it begins with our ability to understand what is happening and what are the basic drives of individuals and how does that map onto their life. And for a lot of us, our most basic needs begin with connection and safety. And so when we talk about safety, safety is something that is filtered through our life experiences, right? Our ability to stay physically safe. But physical safety is only one part of safety. Psychological safety is another very important component of our ability to stay safe. And that speaks to our ability to manage the stress that's happening around us or reach out to someone to help us manage the stress. And here's the truth about safety and physical safety. No matter how physically safe a person is, if they don't have a sense of psychological safety, they'll always act like there's a threat. They'll respond as if there's a threat. One of the things that we know when people feel threatened, when people feel afraid or stressed, is that our bodies can automatically respond. And when our bodies automatically respond, it puts us into this fight, flight, or freeze mode. I'll never forget at Rikers Island, when I was working there, they had a lockdown. And so for anyone who's ever kind of been in a secure facility, residential or detention, you realize that lockdowns are scary because you do not know what's happening. And so apparently someone has stolen some keys. You know, not a big thing at Rikers Island jail. And so some keys were stolen. It took us hours to be able to get out. Finally got out, but Rikers Island is actually an island. And so to get to public transportation, you have to walk across a bridge. And so it's dark at Rikers Island, someone just stole some keys, and I'm walking over the bridge, and I hear some footsteps behind me. So naturally, I also hear the Law and Order sound in my head. Dun, dun, dun. I think it's about to go down. And so my body starts to automatically respond. My muscles start to tense. My shoulders get, tight. My vision narrows. For anyone who's walked to the parking lot late at night, my keys go between these fingers just like that, just in case. It goes down. And so my body's automatically responding. The sympathetic nervous system up here is what's automatically responding. And so the footsteps get closer and closer and closer. And then they speed past me, and I realize they're more afraid of me than I am of them. and my body relaxes in that moment, but the key here is that even outside of my conscious awareness, because of my past life experiences, my body went into automatic self-protection mode. And so sometimes when we're not able to see those layers of our young people, able to understand the experiences that have shaped their life, we're sometimes reading their behavior as personal offense to us rather than protection of self and not having a better way to do it. And so being able to understand how our biology plays a role in this is tremendously important. And part of what we're talking about in terms of unlocking this authentic identity is being able to restore a sense of psychological safety. And before I share how you restore that sense of psychological safety, I want to give you a more expansive picture of how our bodies work when it comes to this fight, flight, or freeze response. It doesn't come out of nowhere. If you were to break the brain down into its most simple form, you could break it into the survival brain and the learning brain. So the learning brain is responsible for it has our frontal lobes. It's responsible for our executive functioning, our ability to control impulses, our ability to be able to wait for that second marshmallow. Our ability to do all these things is controlled by our frontal lobe. But what happens when we feel threatened is the part of our brain that gets immediately activated is our survival brain. This is our limbic system that involves our emotional responses, our amygdala that processes fear, and really sets into motion all of the pieces of ourselves that allow us to feel safe, that allow us to restore some sense of psychological safety. And here's the challenge, and here's what can happen when we're locked in to rules over relationships, is that it's not the actual rules that are the problem, but how we are going about enforcing those rules become the challenge. And so when we talk about unlocking authentic potential, part of our role is to rethink how we're expressing some of these rules. I'll give you an example, and part of my background comes from doing trauma-informed work in a lot of different settings. And so there's this young lady who I was supposed to go see, who was dealing with a lot of different issues. She was out on the kind of recess yard. She was 14 and nearly as tall as me. And she had been dealing with a lot of different issues. And so I was supposed to go and talk to her for the first time. Never had met her. Don't believe I had seen her before. So walking with the coworker. And before I get to her, she sees me coming to her. She shouts, "Why the F are you here?" And I had to take a second and just think to myself, you better be glad I'm trauma informed, right? Because it comes from the gut, and you feel like you got to respond. But in that moment, what we realize is, for some reason, her survival brain was set off in that moment. And in that moment, she responded in a way to try to keep herself safe. So what we did is we walked over and we told her, I'm not here to be a threat. I'm not here to make you feel unsafe in some way. I'm here for X, Y, and Z. Now, for a lot of people, they sometimes believe that either the trauma-informed approach, restorative justice, whatever approach you're using in schools or other settings, that's where the conversation is. But that's not the case. These behaviors and trauma and these experiences, they're not an excuse for behavior, they're an explanation for it. And the reason why that distinction is so important is how we explain things dictates how we deal with it, right? Let me ask you a question. If you guys don't have this like I do, I live in Los Angeles, but if you had lots of traffic and someone cut you off and out of nowhere, what's some of your first reactions? Now don't lose your job with what you're saying right now, okay? Right? Some of your reactions would be very intense, but what if you look over, in the driver's seat is this crazy guy driving, but then in the passenger seat is a pregnant woman who it looks like he's trying to rush to the hospital. How many people's reaction would change from that, right? Some of y'all just evil. You're like, nah, I wouldn't change. They don't need to cut me off. But for most of us, human beings, we would say, wow, they probably aren't even aware of what they're doing. They're just trying to get their wife to the hospital. And that explanation allows us to handle that situation differently. And so the same is the case with the young lady we worked with. We were able to tell her that, I'm not here to threaten you, but also once that survival brain was calm enough, we were able to access that learning brain, because that learning brain comes online when that survival brain is calm. And so we were able to access that survival brain and that learning brain and tell her other ways that she needs to be able to address adults when she's feeling threatened, and also give her an opportunity to be disciplined. And so one of the things that I think is so important for unlocking authentic identity is really being able to allow rules to reinforce relationships. And so sometimes it's not about what we're doing in terms of discipline or consequences, but it's the order in which we're doing it. Are we focusing first on establishing psychological safety? And then from that space, being able to help the young person find a different way to deal with that situation. All while being able to provide consequences and discipline and all these things to hold them accountable, but in a way that allows relationships to rule. And this is more than just kind of a fluffy sense around what relationships are and how we deal with it. It's really about our biology and how our bodies respond to relationship. One of the most important tools that we have in whatever area we're in, whether teacher, mental health professional, administrator, is our ability to be able to help people understand that we get them. Understand that we get them. We call this attunement. Attunement is our emotional responsiveness to situations. And what can happen when we attune with people means that we can really help reset their stress response. There's people have heard of fight, flight, or freeze, but there's another stress response that's called tend and befriend. And tend to befriend is when we connect with other people, our body actually releases a hormone called oxytocin. And this oxytocin helps us calm down. And so over time, if we're able to really be able to help people understand that we get what they're going through, and maybe it doesn't change what we're doing in that moment, but we get it, it allows them to be able to deal with stress in a different way. One of the challenges I think all of us have, me included, is that because we get so focused on success for the young person, we forget that it's important for us to sometimes resist fixing and instead listen, right? Our natural inclination is to fix, but what fixing does sometimes is say, you haven't heard me. You don't see me for who I am, right? A young person comes up to me and says, I think I'm stupid, and I don't have a relationship with that kid, and I just jump and say, no, you're not stupid, you're smart. How do you know that? You don't know me, you don't know what I've been through. You probably say this to everyone. I can't trust you now, right? But if you took an approach that says, what makes you say that? And listen to them and hear them and then get them to do something with you that allows them to demonstrate that they're not stupid, right? Can you help me with this phone? I can't figure out this phone. And they help you with it. And you say, wow, if you're stupid, I'm an idiot, right? And it allows them, based on an authentic connection, an authentic experience, to be able to understand that you see a part of them that they thought you didn't see at first. And so I want you to take a moment as we're talking about how this authentic connection develops, to think about someone when you were young who was attuned to you, who seemed to be emotionally responsive to your needs, and also allowed you to be your authentic self. What was it that they said? What was the tone that they used with you? What was the focus of their conversations with you? And I want you to think about how much do you prioritize that with the young people you work with? How frequently do you prioritize understanding those layers? And it can be challenging because seeing those layers takes some work. And it also takes our ability to sometimes see the invisible. So Ty, he was a young man who, was in and out of foster care and was dealing with a lot of stress. And what we know about stress is stress can cause pressure. And when we talk about the pressure of stress, particularly when kids are young, it may be hard for them to understand what they're dealing with or how to deal with it. So Ty, he had some normal stresses that come with growing up as a young man, trying to make friends, trying to connect, but he had some extreme stresses as well. He grew up in a single family household where his mom abused substances, and this caused tremendous stress. And as that stress continued to build, part of what we realized is that what happened with Ty was that he felt like he had to fend for himself. He had to take care of himself in some way. And so he started to go out on the streets and hang with guys who robbed from other guys. And this is eventually what got him locked up. But that experience, not having someone supporting him and having to deal with that, caused more stress and pressure. And as that pressure continued to build, we realized that Ty was dealing with having not only to handle what's happening on the street, but now being locked up, not really having a family that came to support him, to see him on a regular basis. And when he actually was released, we got a knock on our door. And he came back because there was no running water in his house, and he just wanted to take a shower and get a meal. And all of these different extreme stresses built up over time and made him feel like he was going to pop. Y'all know where this is going. Oh! It gets me every time. Gets me every time. Thanks, mic people. They turned the mic down. That was for y'all. That wasn't for me. That was for y'all. But the reason why I like to do that is, what did it make you guys feel other than why did they invite this man? Right? It made you feel nervous. It made you feel helpless. It made you feel like I can't do anything for this impending explosion that's going to happen to me. And you felt that for 10, 15 seconds. But some of our kids walk with that day in and day out, not knowing why it feels like they're going to explode with rage. Why does it feel like they're going to completely separate themselves from the rest of the world? And much of this is based on their experiences with trauma. And a traumatic event is any event that makes a person feel like their life or the life of someone that they love is highly threatened. And it makes them feel like they're overwhelmed. And part of what you really want to understand when you are dealing with trauma is that it helps you better understand what the layers are of those kids. Now, part of the popping the balloon, what it does is it really allows us to feel that physical reaction. And I always tell people when I pop the balloon, this crowd could never scare me because I actually did that in front of a group of police officers. They were like, boy, you better. Right? And so this idea of feeling constantly threatened and feeling it in your body, where this starts, can be overwhelming. And sometimes our young people don't even understand that this invisible part of who they are is showing up in everything that they do in our schools, in our rec centers, in our churches, and all of our different settings. And when we think about trauma and a trauma-informed approach, I like to compare it to if you have a cough that you can't explain, right? If you have a cough that you can't explain, you're probably like me, you go home, you get in front of your computer, go to WebMD, and realize you have cancer. That's the only possible thing it can be, right? But if you go to your doctor and your doctor says, look, this was, a mild case of bronchitis, we'll get you some antibiotics, you'll be fine. How do you feel even before you take that medication? Feel better, right? You know what's going on with you. And just knowing what's going on with you helps you have some agency, have some control over what happens. But for a lot of our young people, they don't know what's going on with them and why they're feeling the way that they do. And when we're able to dig deeper and understand what's driving who they are and how they're showing up, we're better positioned to be able to truly unlock not only their authentic identity, but also understand the invisible parts that make them who they are. But here's the thing about trauma. Part of when we talk about trauma, we're referring to a lot of these individual traumas, abuse, neglect, and domestic violence. All of these things that our kids may experience that shape who they are and how they understand themselves. A big part of this whole movement has been around how we understand ACEs, adverse child experiences. How many people in here know about ACEs, heard of ACEs? Right, at this point, if you don't know, you're fired. Just joking, kind of. But the idea of adverse child experiences has been really the impetus behind the trauma-informed movement, because what it helped us understand is that trauma is more than just an individual problem. It's a public health issue. And here's part of the reason why it's such an important public health issue for us to understand. When we talk about individual traumas, they come out of a context. And that context for your most challenging kids usually is a context of both intergenerational and historical trauma. And so when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about the trauma that parents have experienced and it's shaped how they're parenting their kids, right? And so one of the most important aspects of parenting is to help kids have environments where they can learn behaviors to support themselves and to take care of people around them. But if your mother is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, your father's dealing with depression and anxiety related to trauma, and their natural response is to withdraw or to be overly demanding or to shout and be hyper-aroused, all these things we see from traumatic reactions, what it does is it can create an environment that makes it really hard for kids to be able to understand not only how to reveal their most authentic self, but how to manage all the parts of them that happen. But here's the other part that's so important for the work that we do. Many of our most vulnerable students come from a family, come from a community that has experienced historical trauma. And historical trauma speaks to this collective wounding that a whole community experiences and can shape the way that community thinks about keeping them safe. So we talked about how individuals think about keeping themselves safe, but this is how a whole community thinks about keeping themselves safe. So when we talk about the Native Americans genocide and also displacement that happened early in our country's founding, when we talk about slavery of Africans and the subsequent Jim Crow laws of African Americans, we talk about Japanese internment, we talk about the Holocaust. These are all historical traumatic events. And one thing that I always want to point out when I mention those events is that whether it was intentional or not, all of those events were sanctioned by the government. Either by laws, either by not enforcing protections for the people who were being harmed and victimized by it. And when we talk about how we engage our families, how we engage our communities, sometimes our perspective can be distorted because we don't understand the history behind their experience. So we have a mother who we're providing all these services for, and they seem like they're not bringing their kid in. And our perspective is like, this is a resistant parent. There's someone who doesn't want the services. When that parent's perspective is, I know how these systems work. The moment I let them talk to one of these counselors, they're taking my kid away. And I'm not gonna have that happen. So when they tell their kid, I don't want you to tell anything to that counselor, it's not necessarily coming from a place of resistance, it's potentially coming from a place of protection and feeling that that's the only way to protect my kid. And what can happen when we're locked out of seeing this invisible part of who we are is that instead of being able to attune to the parent, be emotionally responsive, we instead add more rules. You have to be in by this time. You need to do this paperwork. You have to X, Y, and Z. And we make the burden that much heavier when we're dealing with the invisible and not able to see it. But there's a way to deal with this. What do you guys see on the screen? What do you see on the screen? Can't hear you. You're whispering. You're whispering. Duck, rabbit. That is not your ex. Stop it. So some people see a duck, some people see a rabbit. But here is the truth. No matter what you see, it's the same picture. You've just changed your perspective. And so much of what we do in terms of unlocking the potential of our kids is being able to unlock a new frame, being able to reframe the way we see our young people's behavior. And so when we talk about a reframe, we're talking about not just changing how we're thinking about the situation, but we're talking about expanding it, because expansion means that you don't have to dismiss all the things that you feel, right? You feel like this kid is being disrespectful. You feel like this kid isn't listening to you. It's okay for you to think and feel those things because they may be very valid. But the expansion is, what is the reason for this? Like the teacher who was able to see that hat was not about me, about this kid trying to disrespect me in front of the class. It was really about him trying to stay connected to his mother. And so that expanded perspective allows you to create new opportunities to see students in a different light. You know, with Ty, our young man at the facility we were working at, one of the things we realized is that after he had his situation in the classroom, there was a very important lesson he needed to learn. If you don't like something, you can't poop on it. That was the first lesson. But the second lesson that he needed to learn was that there are people who want to connect and see him reach his potential, and we actually understand the layers. So we talked about Ty. We said, look, this is a kid who grew up in the system. In many ways, we think that we're probably his de facto family, and he wants to find ways to gain attention from us. What's another way that we can help him get this attention? So after he served his punishment for, making art on tables with his biology, we went back and we said, look, Ty, we're initiating a newsletter for the whole facility, and we would like for you to be one of the initial writers, but you have to not have an incident until it comes out. And this is the thing about Ty. We knew he was a very smart young man, and it would have been hard to see that if you just looked at all his behavior. He enjoyed writing. He was a very good writer. And so he said, all right, bet. I'm not gonna have an incident. He didn't have an incident for 3 weeks, which was unheard of for this young man, so that he could be on this initial newsletter. And the thing about that story that's so powerful to me is that we would have missed all of these opportunities to help him learn new ways to deal with what are going to be inevitably challenging situations if we hadn't just reframed how we understood his behavior and who he is. But here's the challenge. Sometimes unlocking this new frame can be difficult because we don't see all of who the young person can be. There's a behavioral economist, his name is Raj Chetty, and he does this fascinating work on what he calls lost Einsteins. He's a Harvard behavioral economist that looks at tax returns and school outcome scores. And what he has found is that we have kids who can potentially cure cancer, but because of their zip code will never get the opportunity. We have so much potential, and in many ways, we miss it because we're so focused on rules and compliance. And so part of what we understand when we look at this holistically is understanding that not just the individual adverse child experiences, but the adverse community environments can play a huge role. So no matter how much we reframe and we help kids try to figure out how to move forward, sometimes there's structural issues at play that we need to be mindful of. And so what can happen with that is that sometimes we can become so lockstep with the problem, right? And we identify some of the behavioral challenges that young people are experiencing as really the focus of our work. And we can get very focused on the deficits that our young people have. They're having problems being able to focus in class. They're having challenges being able to connect with other people. But here's the truth, is that when we have that perspective, what can happen is that the problem and the youth become interchangeable. You can even hear that in the language that people have when they talk about a kid. You know, when they talk about, you know, that's the traumatized kid, that's the homeless kid. It becomes all of who their identity is, and it becomes such a huge issue that it's hard for us to truly see the resilience that young people have. But part of what we understand for us to really be able to get out of this locked perspective of students and youth being the problem is being able to unlock what we understand about their resilience, their recovery, and their restoration. And this really speaks to all of the skills that young people have that we might not have thought about as skills initially, and their ability to survive in very difficult situations. There's stories that are famous for students who have made their way to school and they don't have their pencil or book, and the teacher kind of dismisses them and say, you're not prepared for class, sends them to the office, when the student may have had to get up and make breakfast for their sister and brother, make sure they walk to school, go a different direction so they don't get into a dangerous neighborhood, and done all that just so they can sit in this seat. And so part of our role isn't necessarily to know all of these pieces and have all the answers, but it's for us to have a stance of curiosity. Our ability to wonder, what is it that's driving this behavior? Because these behaviors come from somewhere. And part of what we understand when we talk about trauma-informed approach, when we talk about behavioral health, is that when we think about restoration and helping people heal, young people heal, part of what accelerates that healing process is by creating opportunities for them to address the damage that trauma or another life event has caused. I have a colleague who worked in Bosnia right after the war. He said most of the teens there wanted to be doctors. Why do they want to be doctors? They wanted to be doctors because they saw the devastation that the war did, and they wanted to be a part of the healing, be a part of the restoration. And it was that avenue that really helped them heal, helped them grow from this traumatic experience. And so when we're able to better understand that, we're able to better restore young people. But here's the challenge. Sometimes we have a very locked perspective. I'm going to show you guys a couple of words on the screen. I want you to tell me the color of the words, not the actual words, all right? So go ahead. Go ahead, say it out loud. Oh, got a little tough, huh? Got a little tough. All right, stop it. Y'all sound like a horrible choir or something. So this is a Stroop test. Some of you might be familiar with it. And what it does is the color and the name align for the first two lines, but then they change. The actual name of the color and the actual color of the word changes, and it becomes more difficult for you to say the actual color that the word is. And so when we have situations that seem somewhat familiar, but they don't completely align with our beliefs or where we might be at the moment, it can create some dissonance. It can create some tension. It can make it more difficult for us to make these decisions. And this is a relatively benign experiment, but a more profound experiment was done with the implicit association test that focuses on our unconscious biases. And what they said is, we want to see if it takes people longer to identify a weapon or a non-weapon depending on the race of the individual. And so they put up a face of a white person and then an object, a black person, and then an object, and then they did it again and they swapped it out and an object. And part of what they found through that was people's ability to say that it was a weapon when it was a blackface was accurate and quick, and to say it was a non-weapon when it was a whiteface was accurate and quick as well. But what happened was, when it was a blackface with a non-weapon or a whiteface with a weapon, it took a little bit longer. They still might have gotten it right, but it took a little bit longer because it created this dissonance with some of their beliefs. And this was people of all races. And sometimes when we're trying to understand our students holistically, we have blind spots. And these blind spots can shape the disciplinary practices that we have, how we deal with situations. I have, for one of the teams that I'm working with around the country, the principal, the vice principal, was a black principal, was wondering why there was such a disproportionate level of discipline for her black students. And she realized that what happened was that teachers throughout the school, outside of their awareness, were describing the same behavior differently. So a white kid, hits another kid with the pencil, they say he poked him with the pencil. A black or Latino kid does that, they say he stabbed him with the pencil. Same behavior, described differently, requires different responses. And so being able to identify our blind spots begins with us being able to identify our biases that we all have. It's shortcuts to understand the world, but it's also being able to unlock cultural responsiveness. And when we talk about cultural responsiveness, part of what we're talking about is our ability to not just acknowledge the experience of other people and how they've navigated the world, but to also ask the pivotal questions that will reshape how we manage them in the classroom, in the school, in the community. And here's the thing. One of the most important things to do is not just gather the information, gather the data, but it's actually to adjust the settings that you're in. And this culturally responsive approach is something that me and my team developed for the Bridge Trauma Informed Culture Responsive program, because we felt that many people already have a lot of these skills to build relationships, but don't have a structure on how to implement it in their school, in their different environments. And so as we thought about this, part of what we thought about is an additional blind spot for many of us, though, is privilege. With great privilege comes great responsibility. There's the power of resilience that comes from people who've dealt with trauma, dealt with difficult life circumstances, that allows us to move in the direction that we need to move. But then there's a power of privilege that we all have. And privilege is simply being accepted for who you are without needing to change and potentially having power in that situation. I am a black, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian male. Now, the reason I say that is because in the black church, I have privilege. And part of my journey over the past couple of years has been learning more about the LGBTQ community and fighting homophobia within the black church, because it's an area where I have privilege and my voice might be heard differently than someone who's coming from the oppressed community. And what we know is that all of us have the opportunity to use our privilege to change the situations, to change the lives of the young people that we're working with, and to really create the type of system change that's required for us to get to this place, where we're moving beyond equality toward equity. Equality says, let's give them all the same, because we're not taking who they are into context. Equity says, give them what they need based on how we know them. And that's the place that we want to go. That's the place when we start to think beyond what it means to get a good grade or what it means to have this kid behave. We think about success as the journey of a young person who's able to create healthy and connected relationships. We think about it as the ability for us to see those invisible wounds that come from trauma and help them heal from it and use their resilience to grow. We see it as the culturally responsive practices that we do in order to help see the full and whole child that we're working with and their family. And then we also see it when we look inside ourselves and understand what might be some of our blind spots and what might be some of our strengths that allow us to connect more deeply with the young people we work with, because that is when we realize this potential. And I may be finished, but we better just be getting started. Thank you, guys.